Good morning. I'm Ambassador Josette Sheeran, Executive Chairman of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us for the McCain Institute's inaugural Human Rights and Democracy Summit event. We are hosting this event to coincide with the upcoming Summit for Democracy, taking place later this week on December 9th and 10th. Defending human rights and democracy are at the core of the McCain Institute's work. With democratic norms and human rights under attack around the world, this conversation could not be happening at a more important time. Today's discussion will examine two major threats to democracy: forced labor and attacks on democracy defenders. The first half of our program will focus on galvanizing international cooperation to eliminate forced labor from global supply chains. In partnership with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery and Humanity United, this conversation features civil society and government leaders from democracies taking steps to eliminate forced labor. The second half of today's event focuses on the perils of defending democracy and will present perspectives from around the world. Journalists and activists from Turkey, Russia, and Venezuela will share the threats they face, their firsthand experiences, and their expectations of the US government. To get us started, I'm honored to introduce the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Katherine Tai. Ambassador Tai has been a champion and outspoken advocate for ending the use of forced labor and using trade as a force for good. Ambassador Tai worked tirelessly with our G7 allies to make clear that a rules-based trading system has no place for forced labor. I'm proud to have worked as Deputy Trade Representative, and I know the power that you can bring to the table, Ambassador Tai. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. As the United States Trade Representative, I'm honored to participate in the Summit for Democracy, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to address this convening of stakeholders about the importance of ending forced labor in global supply chains. The Biden-Harris administration is deeply committed to ending forced labor around the world. We know that there are currently over 25 million workers worldwide, including women and children, who are forced to work against their will in harsh conditions. Their voices must be heard, and we are energized to work alongside your organizations, other governments, multilateral institutions, the private sector, and survivors to address what is a gross violation of human rights and an unconscionably unfair trade practice. We will be more effective if our trading partners also commit to promoting, protecting, and enforcing internationally recognized workers' rights as part of their trade policies and make clear that forced labor has no place in the global trading system. That is why I'm so grateful for the work that your impressive network of civil society stakeholders has done to influence the agendas of policymakers and institutions across the globe. Specifically, we greatly appreciated your push to combat forced labor in global supply chains ahead of the G7 Leaders Summit in Cornwall and the G7 Trade Ministers meeting in London. The G7 Trade Ministers' statement on forced labor reflects the best practices that many of you have been carrying out alongside our governments, multilateral institutions, and businesses over the last 25 years. The communiqué expresses our shared desire to prevent this harmful practice, as well as to protect and provide remedy for those affected by it. While the G7 communiqué was a significant development, the United States has made forced labor issues a priority in other important bilateral, regional, and multilateral engagements. For example, we continue to push for the World Trade Organization negotiations on fishing subsidies to address the prevalent use of forced labor on fishing vessels, especially in distant water fishing fleets. In addition, at the inaugural meeting of the Trade and Technology Council in September, the United States and EU agreed to strengthen our joint efforts to protect workers and labor rights and combat forced and child labor. Finally, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement includes some of the strongest forced labor obligations in the world. These provisions enable our countries to work together to prohibit the importation of goods produced by forced labor. This cooperation is proof that we can raise regional labor standards and that North America can provide an example for the rest of the world to follow. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we make progress in securing commitments from many of our trading partners. Together, we can harness the collective power of this network to translate these commitments into concrete action that eliminates forced labor and protects the people most at risk in our global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. We're grateful for your continued commitment and leadership on this important topic. Next, I'd like to invite U.S. Labor Secretary Walsh to speak to the leading role that the United States has in bringing together democratic nations to respond to forced labor, both within our own borders and internationally. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you to the McCain Institute, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and Humanity United for hosting this event. And thank you to everyone for joining us from around the globe today. President Biden has said, democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, and renew it. In the Department of Labor, we are fighting for democracy every day. That's because democracy requires protecting workers' rights and ending forced labor, both here in the United States and around the world. These are top priorities in the Biden-Harris administration. We want to empower workers with good jobs, clear rights, and a voice in their work. Strong, independent democratic unions are the best way to make sure workers have a seat at the table where policies are made. And these policies are critical to protecting against the worst labor abuses: forced labor, child labor, and modern slavery. When governments don't enforce strong labor laws, it creates an opening for bad actor employers to exploit workers. Too often, these companies pressure governments not to enforce labor laws. And in some cases, governments are perpetrators themselves. We have to do more to make all labor exploitation unprofitable, unacceptable, and bad for business. This means holding governments and businesses accountable using all available tools, from research to trade to diplomacy to multilateral action. We want to partner with other democracies that are willing to do the same. Together, we can build a coalition to stop labor abuses throughout the global supply chain, and we can lift up and empower workers in vulnerable populations. At the Department of Labor, we're doing our part to end forced labor, and we're researching and sharing tools. We are making sure that our trading partners honor their commitments on labor rights, and we are helping develop international standards and frameworks that strengthens protections for workers globally. If we want to win a democratic future, we need to create pathways to economic security for all. We need to provide access to education, skills, and opportunity for all. And we need to protect the rights of workers to form independent unions and bargain collectively. Democracy is built on a foundation of respect for human rights and labor standards. In this administration, we are committed to those values, and we are committed to partnering with anyone who shares them. Thank you once again for all the work you do to advance workers' rights and fight for democracy.
Thank you, Secretary Walsh. We're grateful for the Department of Labor's continued efforts on this important issue. I'd like to introduce the moderator for the first panel. Alex Thier is the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery and is joined by civil society and government leaders from democracies taking steps to eliminate forced labor. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Josette. It's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Alex Thier. I'm the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. The Global Fund is working around the world to bring together leaders, partners, and resources to free millions from the tyranny of human trafficking and forced labor. We are thrilled to be a part of this Summit for Democracy, which is bringing together those struggling for rights and freedoms for all the world to create action. And we have an amazing panel of leaders here with us today who are acting to create and implement new legal regimes in the battle against forced labor. So let me start out by introducing them. We have Senator Julie Meville-Deschênes, who is an independent Canadian senator and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group to end modern slavery and human trafficking. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Heidi Hautala, the Finnish Green Party member who is the Vice President of the European Parliament and chair of the cross-party parliamentary group on responsible business conduct. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, we have Leo Sakamoto. Leo is a Brazilian journalist, president and founder of Reporter Brazil, and a board member of the UN Fund for Contemporary Forms of Slavery from 2014 to 2020. Welcome, Leo.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So I want to begin by asking how you all came to this important work, to this important fight. Julie, as I mentioned, you're co-chair of Canada's all-party parliamentary group to end modern slavery and human trafficking. How did you get interested and involved in working on this area? What brought you to the issue of human trafficking?
Well, briefly, I've been a journalist for a long time and I've covered many countries, Haiti, for example. So I saw inequalities, violence against women, poverty, child labor. And in Canada, we talk a lot about those questions, but not that much action. Also, I was the head of a feminist advisory council in Quebec. So I researched forced marriage, honor crime in Britain, for example, prostitution, trafficking of young women. So I've been very aware of many of the arms that define modern slavery. And I'm a very senator. I've been a senator for only 3.5 years, but I became a senator because I wanted to change the world. I know this is, what can I say? Will I be able to? I don't know. But obviously, I wanted some of those issues, I wanted to push them to see if I could change things. And I was lucky. I met this great MP who had worked on this file for a few years. And then I joined the group on modern slavery. And obviously, when you're many parties, I'm an independent senator, but I have to find allies. So it's a nonpartisan issue. And it has become one of my main battles.
Well, and it's so great to remember that all of us working on this, we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us and who've been building towards this fight. And Heidi, you have a really amazing record of public service. You've been a national legislator, a minister in your own government. You're now vice president of the European Parliament. I imagine that means dealing with everything under the sun. And there's a lot of priorities in the world today, but I'm curious if you could tell us if you think this is a critical moment in time for us to be dealing with the issue of forced labor in our supply chains and why that might be.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I definitely think now there is the momentum for many reasons. I think the COVID crisis has made many more people aware of the deficiencies and even crimes in our supply chains and value chains of products and services that companies provide to us. And the European Union has undertaken to become, I would say, a front runner in implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, not only as a set of voluntary mechanisms, but also as a mandatory legislation. So that's what we are dealing with. And of course, apart from the pressure coming from the European Parliament, which is now really cross-party, it was very helpful that G7 has entered into this discussion quite forcefully. And perhaps this was an additional factor that made the European Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, to declare in her annual State of the Union address to the European Parliament and to the whole world, actually, that the Commission was committed to introduce a ban on forced labor. So that's how we got here. And I must say that we also have this cross-party working group on what we call responsible business conduct. And as Julie, I also would like to say that the way in politics to change things is to go cross-party, because there are issues, and you find people in all political parties and movements that want to work towards the same goals.
Well, that's great. And I want to come back to this legislation and what it's going to take to get that done. But let me turn to you, Leo. You and your team at Reporter Brazil have been delivering transparency and accountability against powerful actors for some time now. How did you get involved in this work? And do you think that we're making progress? Is it getting better or getting worse?
Well, to answer that, I'd like to tell a short story. Jonas lost count of how many times he got cold soaked by the strong Amazon rainforest under a yellow tent that served as home during weekends. He worked with a chainsaw making fences for his employer's cattle out of the forest trees so big that could not fit in a hug by two adult men. Jonas went hungry, got dengue fever, and did not receive a single penny during the 2 years he worked for his boss, only food. I was in the operation that released Jonas almost 20 years ago. He was just 13 years old. Who are the people that stole Jonas' future? The farmers he worked for, not only ones to profit from the slavery and deforestation. Who are the cattle breeders, slaughterhouse that bought from the farmer, and the supermarkets that bought from them, and the consumers that bought from them too? These questions haunt us. It's because of victims like Jonas that we, a group of investigative journalists, founded Reporter Brazil 20 years ago. And it's because people like Jonas that we tracked supply chains of over 2,000 farms, charcoal camps, construction sites from which the Brazilian government has released enslaved people. The results of the supply chain investigations are employed to convince companies they need to adopt transparent policies to fight slave labor and to monitor their own supply chains. And we have also strongly worked to involve the banking system, the financial system in the fight against slavery too. In one hand, it's important to recognize that the corporations and governments work to include the reflections on how they impact the production chains. In other hand, it's inevitable to recognize that since problems have persisted, we need to move forward in building new forms of regulation, global chains, even establishing mandatory mechanisms of corporate accountability. And this is very difficult.
Well, thank you for sharing that story and the powerful thing that has brought you and so many to this work. Maybe I can expand on that story of one person to talk about this as a global issue. We know from the work that the International Labor Organization, our own organization, and others have done, that globally the number of people in conditions of modern slavery, in forced labor, in child labor are actually going up. And it's already so many people, 25 million in forced labor, that it's unthinkable. But Julie, at the moment, this issue that Leo is talking about of global supply chains that are making us think about where our products come from, how they're made, and particularly who is making them and what conditions they are living in as they're being made, is rising on the global agenda, as Heidi said. So let's talk about what can be done about this. You have recently introduced or reintroduced a new bill in Canada on modern slavery and supply chains. Can you tell us about this bill and what it is that you hope it's going to do to make this problem better?
Well, I would like Canada to at least do something, a modest progress. We were talking about modern slavery recently. The government had to admit that they were buying medical gloves during the pandemic in Malaysia, and that the allegations of forced labor were rampant. So if the government is doing it for its procurement, you understand that the country is nowhere. So this bill, it's a private member bill. I have to say that it's me in my office. So it was written, and I had the help, obviously, of the group, and now it's been reintroduced 4 times. this same bill. So you see how difficult it is to progress. The idea, it's a transparency bill. So the idea, and it's modest, is to ask big companies, large companies, to look into their supply chain and to find the risk of forced labor and child labor. We're doing both. And to report once a year publicly. The whole idea of this is being public is important. And we have penalties in our bill. It's not like the UK bill or the Australian bill. We have some penalties for those who will not report. Obviously, transparency bills have been criticized not being strong enough. But I think particularly being a senator, and this is a private member bill, I need to build consensus. So this is the beginning. Let's start a conversation. And it's name or shame. Companies who won't report will be denounced. We have human rights groups. We have citizens who want to buy products that are not made with children labor. So this is the start, and I hope that I will be able to build consensus. And what I hope is that the government at one point will say we need to act and take this legislation and pass it through with all their means, because obviously government have more means than a simple senator. But the idea is to talk about it. Recently we just learned that our tomato cans, Del Monte tomato cans, contained tomatoes that that comes from China, from the province of Zhejiang, where Uyghurs are holed up in captivity, and there was, rampant allegation of forced labor. So how can we accept that as a society? We can't. So that's why I'm trying to pass that bill.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I love the fact that you're on your fourth try, not because I like that it's hard for you to do it, but because you are sticking with it, because it's often what it takes. But what's it going to take to get it passed? And hopefully we've got people watching from all over the world. Is there anything that people can do to help you to get this higher on the agenda?
Obviously, there's internal work in the parliament, but there's also what the citizens think. So I'm trying to interest the media in what I'm doing, but obviously citizens raising everywhere in Canada and elsewhere to denounce modern slavery and say that they don't want to participate in those gross human rights violations can help. You remember how one citizen, Greta Thunberg, was extremely important on one issue. So we have champions, and in Canada, you have also companies that are doing a good job. So the idea is to try to encourage those companies to talk and to say it can be done. We can look in our supply chain. Going after the lowest price all the time, it's not the way to do it. So it's a fundamental change here. We're asking companies not to bring in the cheaper product, but products that are done by a manpower that is decently paid. And that's really a big change.
That's great. Heidi, let me turn to you, because as you already mentioned, the EU has stepped into the debate on eradicating forced labor in a huge way this year. In March of 2021, you passed a resolution calling for legislative proposals for an EU-wide mandatory supply chain due diligence, and maybe you can explain to people what that means. And as you said, in September, President von der Leyen announced the intention to pass an import ban on products made with forced labor into the EU market, something that we have and only recently using here in the US, but to very powerful effect. I think that the US has blocked something like $500 million worth of goods this year. These are potentially huge steps for the world's largest market. Tell us, do you think that this is gonna happen, and what impact could it have?
Yeah, I think it will happen. And just like Julie, I also feel very much that the civil society, progressive businesses, consumer groups, even individual consumers are really calling for responsible products, ethically produced products. So the European Commission has heard this call, And almost 2 years, 1.5 years ago, the European Commission, which is our executive, announced that they would go for what we can call mandatory human rights and environment due diligence. It's horizontal. It's not just any sector. It's not just voluntary measures. It's like Leonardo was calling, it's going to be mandatory, so obliging. This is, yes, it's about transparency, but it's also about obligations. So there are some parallel legislations, like now we are working on a corporate sustainability reporting directive, which is an update of what we used to call non-financial reporting. But you see, now we can talk about sustainability, which has many dimensions. So one of the lessons here is that we need to learn to think and decide in an integrated way. It's not just one sector, one element, one branch of government. Everybody must work together. And that is perhaps the reason why this legislation from the European Commission is now slightly delayed, because it's very complex. It's a milestone. It's like the late John Ruggie, who was the father of the guiding principles, who became very good friends with a small group of MEPs, members of the European Parliament, because he was really paying attention to what the EU was doing. So he said that this is revolutionary. What we're doing is a revolution. And I would tend to agree with him very much. So for his memory, I want to say this, because he's really been a great influence for us. So by the side of this kind of value chain accountability, we're also waiting for the Commission to decide how they are going to introduce this import ban on products produced with forced labor. It's not entirely clear. I think some want to sort of incorporate it into the due diligence legislation, and certainly that legislation will have an impact and give chances to eradicate forced labor from the value chains. But what many of us are now insisting is that we need, by the side of that legislation, we need an import ban. And my favorite example is the US model. And I've acquainted myself with the US model, and I'm really quite impressed how it was possible to tackle the Malaysian rubber gloves produced with migrant forced labor. And for me, it's very important that we also engage in development policy, because this is not just about cleansing our conscience, to become good consumers. But it's also about improving the conditions of people's lives in the producing countries, and of course saving the environment as well. So what we need to put all our efforts into development cooperation so that this can succeed, because otherwise it remains something for us who can afford making choices.
If I can just add a little something on
Sure.
import bans, because you're right that the US had a law on its book since 1930, but now they're really putting into action. So if you compare the action of the US having lists of countries and product that should be not enter the US, and our situation, we're really very timid, very shy. We've had a law on the books for about 14 months. We stopped only one shipment from China. And because of our privacy law, we don't know which companies in China was involved. We don't know which Canadian companies. So I agree with Heidi that, to put in place those import bans, it's very difficult, but it's one of the best way to show to the companies that they will lose the entirety of their shipment. They will lose money if they don't respect the rules. And you're right about transparency laws being absolutely less strong than due diligence, but we have penalties for people who not report. It's obviously a first step, but it's a law that has some penalties.
And, I will say, Heidi, to your point about a revolution, I was recently at a conference that Liechtenstein put on for the finance industry about fighting against slavery and trafficking. And all of these import ban orders coming out of the United States for gloves and solar panels and cotton and tomatoes and other things, is really causing the financial industry to wake up too, because as I was describing it at the conference, they're going from an ethical requirement, which is nice, to material risk. And when they start to see these issues hitting their bottom line, they will act. And so that's very powerful. And I think that the announcement of the potential EU legislation, which happened just before this conference, is making a lot of people pay attention to what could be a very changed world. Leo, let me turn to you, because your work has been heavily engaged with a pioneering act by the Brazilian government at one point to create a so-called dirty list of companies that were involved in labor exploitation. And I'm curious, hearing this conversation, how important are these new laws and new regimes that Julie and Heidi and others are talking about? And in your experience, what is really needed to turn a good idea, good legislation, into something that's actually going to make a difference for those who were really trying to help, like Jonas, who you were talking about before?
Well, first of all, I believe it's very important, all these international laws that works with supply chain, that works with importing goods, that look at the supply chains in not just a national but to an international level. This could be the jump of changing the next years. Information is the raw material of all of these changes, in my opinion. Information is fundamental to push companies to make something, but more important than that, information is important to feed social organizations, civil society that will monitoring everything. I'm not saying that companies won't do that if there is nobody looking, but it's more difficult to happen that. And it's important that civil society has very strong tools in their hands to make the difference too, and push companies and push governments and push everybody to a better direction. We know that Brazilian case is unique in some ways due to legal advances and regulations approved over the time, like having a public structure that inspects, complains, and free workers almost daily. In Brazil, we had, since 1995, officially 57,000 workers released from slavery by the government. It's a lot of people. At the same time, since 2003, Brazil created, after a lot of pressure from civil society, the dirt list of slave labor, as you said, that is a public database with the names of companies and people who were responsibilized by the government by using slaves. This information of this dirty list has been used so much by the companies to risk management, before make agreements, before loan money, before everything. And it's very interesting because some time ago I was invited in the Congress, Brazilian National Congress, talking about dirty list, and congressman said, well, now I would like to know more about this communist thing called dirt list. I say, sorry, man, but there is few people so capitalist as the dirty list, because it became possible, the market works properly with a lot of information and take decisions by the daylight. Is different. If you want to plan it everything like a communist regime, obliging B to buy from A, we can do it, but this is capitalism. At the same time, we had some regulations. We have the Brazilian Central Bank working to make possible to forbid rural credit for anyone that uses slave labor. There is a lot of things that can do, but it's necessary remember too that the problem is not just avoid importing goods with slavery, but avoid companies exploring slave labor far from home. There are companies that run from laws and that protect workers and protect environments in the north and going to do that in the south. That's why it's very important to go ahead. I believe that Australian law, UK law, European Union law, French law, Canadian, United States, Brazilian law, everything helped a lot and helping to change. But we need to remember to go further in a system that replaces voluntary principles to binding principles.
I think that's very powerful and an important reminder that these supply chains that feed on so much exploitation and forced labor affect all of us. And we are all accountable for the continuation and perpetuation of forced labor. And also that responsible business is good for business. It's not bad for business. It's only bad for those who are unethical and irresponsible. Let me ask you, we're here at this Summit for Democracy. Why are we talking about forced labor at a Summit for Democracy? I mean, Julie, I wonder if you can talk, you're a senator in a great democracy. Do you believe that ending forced labor is important, not only for your own democracy, which would be interesting to hear, but also for the overall success of democracy and what democracy really means in the world today?
Well, yes, I think it's also an issue of defending this model of democracies, in the sense that if we cannot uphold the law, if we accept gross violation of human rights, in our country, we have some too, but abroad, how can we believe that democracy will be seen as a legitimate system that works if the foundation of democracies is to go and get goods elsewhere in poorer country where there is forced labor? How can we believe in democracy? So I think we're giving tools and we're giving arguments to citizens or people or countries who would oppose democracy, in saying that this is just a big dream, and at the bottom there are all those people suffering. So I think obviously capitalism is at the heart of it. I hope it can change, but also I would say that not only we have to look in our supply chains, but we have to address the bigger problem, as Heidi was saying. It's one thing to kick out of companies kids and people who try to make a living, but there has to be remediation. Those victims have to be put back to school, have to work somewhere. We have to contribute more in terms of development to those countries. The root of supply chain being contaminated by forced labor is poverty, inequality, and obviously I know it's difficult, and I'm not saying it can be solved overnight, but we have to make a real effort to share those resources in a world where there's not only forced labor, but there's also climate change, and we have migrants that are just crossing borders, and things are getting really hard for so many people. And we cannot just be sitting here in our chair and saying, we're the rich country and our products are cheap. This is just too easy.
Maybe just a quick follow-up, Julie. One of the criticisms of holding a summit for democracy in the U.S. is that maybe our own record of being a democracy or a shining city on the hill has not been perfect, maybe ever, but certainly it's been challenged in the last couple of years. And that's, I think, causing many people to shine the light on ourselves, right? What are we doing at home? And, I know that Canada, like the United States, has challenges with forced labor domestically as well. And I'm just curious if you think that is there a commitment or a pathway to make sure that we're also doing the work at home to make sure that this problem doesn't persist?
Well, I always insist on that part of the equation, because it's a bit too easy to think that we are perfect. We're not. We are, there's a worker shortage in Canada, as there is in many places. We're using more and more temporary workers, migrants in Canada. And sometimes there are horror stories. There's debt bondage. There are things we should not accept. In the summer, not many Canadians want to work in the field. So we have all those migrant workers coming from so many countries. And during the pandemic, they were just locked in their lodging because the owner didn't want them to go anywhere. So there are situations that we have to address. We have laws, we have groups that are helping out, but the US is, as you know, has many challenges. Prison workers, very low salaries, all those migrants coming from Mexico. We have our own challenges, and it's also important to solve them before lecturing others.
Yeah, exactly. Heidi, one of the fundamental themes of this Summit for Democracy is about getting democracies to collaborate, to cooperate with each other to solve our biggest challenges. As we see happening with climate, as we see hopefully happening with the pandemic, and hopefully that we see increasingly with forced labor. You mentioned, for example, the G7 statement on eradicating forced labor from supply chains. The EU is in many ways the greatest experiment on cooperation among democracies that the world has ever seen. Although some of the members are struggling a little bit on their measures of how democratic they are. I'm curious if you think that a focus on forced labor is actually something that can help to increase cooperation in general among democracies, both in the EU and globally.
Yeah, I think this is a task that we must undertake. And there are very good initiatives here and there. But we also have a common basis. We have the 2011 UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is a perfect guide to what needs to be done. And why this needs to be done internationally, of course, is that markets are global. So I would say that now we have maybe indeed we might need a global summit on business and human rights to see how we can generalize and make these laws that Leonardo, Julia, and me are talking about make truly universal, because they are perfect implementation of international human rights conventions. Everybody must have a dignity, the right to decent work. We have enough of that. But the question is that we need to implement it now, and we can only implement it together. So I would like to say that this is a very big task for democracies. And then we can also invite or even force authoritarian countries to do away with practices that are against human dignity. I would like to give you an example that we have a lot of discussions in Europe, like everywhere, about the Uyghurs. And we sort of realized that we can, of course, try to write into our draft comprehensive agreement on investments, commitments to ratifying of important ILO conventions against forced labor. But honestly, nobody really trusts that China would be doing that. So the beauty of these measures that we are discussing now, that we don't have to negotiate them with another country and another government. We can just invite and oblige our own companies and entities to fulfill them. And let me say that I see the next task already coming for Europe once this all is done, the due diligence legislation, including or excluding or having a side instrument on labor force ban. I think we have to extend that also to public entities, because there's no logic in asking the private sector to be accountable and responsible. We have to, public procurement of governments and all kinds of public entities. At least in Europe, it's about 16 to 18% of the GDP. It has a huge economic value, and then it has a huge impact on human rights and environment if we oblige public entities to use public procurement in a responsible way. So I see this coming. Sweden has already proposed legislation on obliging public procurers to follow the various aspects of sustainability. So there's a lot to do, and we have to do it together.
So the good news here in my bill, there is public procurements where we're including government institution in this obligation to report. I'm not there yet, but it's part of it, and for exactly the reason you said,
That's great. And the US government often points out, in fact, I think they're re-releasing a new revised national strategy to combat trafficking. The US government is the largest purchaser, single largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. And so if they can do what you're describing, it will be powerful. But there's a problem. And I want to bring this to Leo, which is a problem of information, right? Many people would probably do the right thing if that information were available and verified. Many probably wouldn't, but we need more information. We need better information. The import ban law that the US has in place, one of the reasons that it works today is actually an extraordinary cooperation with a group of civil society organizations called the Tariff Act Advisory Group, who file petitions to our US Customs and Border Patrol with evidence and information about forced labor that they then act on. They don't have enough capacity to do it themselves. So there's such a critical role for civil society, for journalism, to unearth this information, and of course, increasingly for companies to be reporting it themselves. But Leo, that's where you come from. That's what you've been doing, right? And I don't have to tell you that protecting journalists and ensuring that they can do their work is at the very bedrock of democracy. And the work that you do specifically to expose criminality and corruption and exploitation, I know is very dangerous. And so it'd be great if you could talk to us a little bit about why you and your colleagues are taking that risk. Why is there a need to take that risk to make sure that this information is getting out there, not only for Brazil, but as you said yourself, for the consumers in North America and in Europe who are drinking coffee that are picked with Brazilian forced labor?
Well, I'd like to tell you that over the last 20 years, Reporter Brazil, that it's a press organization, but it's a civil society organization at the same time, have faced attacks and harassments from economic and political sectors that benefit from slave labor, human trafficking, deforestation. However, the situation has worsened a lot during President Jair Bolsonaro's government. I know that you heard a lot this name, but it's necessary to say Jair Bolsonaro's government. Since cattle ranchers, loggers, miners who conduct their activities illegally are part of the government support base and have been acting with impunity. Several government agencies here had their data transparency reduced, violating the 2011 public data law, then their public servants prevented from giving interviews. Today, government has chosen media and civil society organizations that work on guarantee human rights and as its enemies, and systematically tries to criminalize them. Even the Brazilian government ministers have been trying to silence journalists and activists in courts, filing lawsuits against them based on legislation remaining from the Brazilian military dictatorship era. Consequently, violence against press, organizations, social movements has escalated in rural areas, with people being executed from defending their land or for speaking out against actions that affront the dignity of vulnerable groups. I have been systematically attacked personally by the president family and ministers and congressmen and businessmen aligned to the government, not the business, aligned to the laws. Defamation campaigns against journalists, death threats, and so on. This reinforces how important the support from international organizations and the coverage of international media, not just in Brazil, but in any country ruled by an authoritarian government. It's important to strengthen a network connecting international organizations and local organizations, giving them support. It's important international legal standards. It's important countries demand it from other countries. It's important countries demand their companies. It's important highlight countries that attacks and kill journalists. You have the Committee for Protection of Journalists. You have Reporters Sans Frontiers. You have a lot of organizations that shows what's happening. And at the end, financial, technical, and institutional support given by partners around the globe are essential to ensure that achievements and milestones are not lost and we can go ahead. In Brazil and in any country ruled by negationists, the storm is dark in this moment, but I believe that will pass.
Can I say in this context that I think it's really important that democracies also introduce instruments to protect this kind of important work that Leonardo is doing and his colleagues and friends. The EU is now planning legislation against the strategic lawsuits against public participation. We call it SLAP, I guess you do as well. And we have a rather new legislation on the protection of whistleblowers. So all this is important. And in the future due diligence legislation, we have to make sure that there will be grievance mechanisms for civil society, employees, labor unions, and other stakeholders to bring complaints to the company without the fear of retaliation. So indeed, I think the question of the protection of human rights defenders of all kinds is really key today, because we see so many being harassed and killed, also relating very much to mining and agribusiness, land use, indigenous peoples. And let me say that that's why many of us in the European Parliament are very skeptical about ratifying the Mercosur free trade agreement, because we do not want to be complicit in what is now happening in Bolsonaro's Brazil. So let's see how this develops, but there need to be more guarantees. This needs to be changing.
Well, I want to add an amen to what Heidi just said. You know, I think a lot of the discussion at this Summit for Democracy is focused on the need to protect the defenders of human rights. And we thank you personally, Leo, and wish you safety and continued success in that work, because I know it's not easy. We are coming to the end of our time, and it's been an extraordinary conversation. Let me just ask each of you for your final 30 seconds, if you have it. We're going to have, unfortunately, virtually, given the world that we live in, but we've got 100 world leaders getting together to talk about democracy and democratic cooperation. You've all talked about the need for a much stronger and broader citizen and civil society movement to make sure that the pressure is on those leaders to do the right thing and to end forced labor. Julie, do you have a message that you want to leave people with?
It's so difficult. I just think we should act. I think we had great ideas today. Thank you, Leonardo and ID. You know, you gave me many, many ideas. Yes, protection of journalists, of whistleblower, all that is extremely important. And we need courage. We need courage to act in our world, in the rich countries. And so, you know, and give the example. I think this is what we should do.
Thank you. Heidi, any thoughts?
Well, I think we have to learn from one another in the field of making finance sustainable and responsible, and therefore also business will follow. And so I'm seeing a big change, transformative process, and let's just make all together this happen, so that there will be a full transformation of our economies and societies so that they are sustainable.
It's a beautiful vision. Leo, last thought to you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm very glad to talk with you all. And just to remember that if labor exploitation, slave labor, and human trafficking are global, the fight against them need to be global too. And it's important. This is not a fight that we win alone, European Union, Canada, Brazil. No, this is a fight for worldwide, because we are talking about the global production networks too. And let's stay together.
Well, thank you. You know, the reason that the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery was created was to make this a global fight, to try to bring in more partners, more resources, and reach the people who need this support that we've all been talking about to eradicate these horrendous crimes and make sure that everyone on the planet has an opportunity to live a life of dignity and enjoy decent work and fulfill their personal potential and ambition. You are all three, Julie, Heidi, Leo, extraordinary leaders. Thank you so much for what you are doing and for joining us and for demonstrating for all of those watching how we can all do more to address this challenge. I want to thank our audience, our partners at McCain Institute and Humanity United for helping us to put this together, and look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. It's great to see government leaders and civil society coming together to make meaningful progress. Next, I'd like to introduce Philippe Sion, Managing Director of Forced Labor and Human Trafficking at Humanity United. Philippe, we're so grateful for HU's partnership on this event and your leadership in preventing and ending forced labor around the world.
Thank you, Ambassador Josette Sheeran, and welcome everyone to this panel on galvanizing cooperation among democracies to end forced labor. On behalf of Humanity United and our partners at the McCain Institute and the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to discuss how we accelerate efforts to address forced labor. My name is Philippe Sion. I'm a Managing Director at Humanity United, overseeing our work to address forced labor and human trafficking. And it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to James Kofi Annan, founder and president of Challenging Heights, based in Ghana. Challenging Heights' mission is to protect children's rights and end child trafficking. Thank you for being here. A warm welcome as well to Pamela Marr, executive vice president for knowledge and application at the Fund Group, based in Hong Kong. The Fund Group runs global consumer products supply chains for major brands and retails, operating a factory network in over 40 economies worldwide. So let's start with the first question. Today's session is taking place as the US government is hosting a range of global stakeholders to focus on and support the notion of democracy. On the policy front, there is existing legislation on preventing and punishing trafficking activities all around the world. And yet, we so often see failures on the implementation side of legislation. Why are these legislations failing short, and how do you see your role in addressing this gap? James, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be part of this conversation. I have observed over the years that some legislative instruments that have worked in some countries, others have also failed, as you rightly put it. But one of the key areas that makes some legislations fail is political will, or as some will put it, political expediency. So there are, in some economies and in some democracies, some politicians believe that implementing policy and legislative instrument to the full affect their fortunes. So for instance, in Ghana, most of the perpetrators of modern slavery and human trafficking are in the informal sector in a mass, heavily populated areas. And nearly everyone is connected in one way or the other. And the law, which was passed in 2005, makes it an offense for anyone who contributed in any way in enslaving another. So what that means that if the government is going to enforce the law fully, it's going to then affect so many individuals. And those so many individuals then would affect the fortunes of the government's political future. So that is the reason why in Ghana and in Africa, for that matter, the legislations are failing. So we have the laws there, but they still, because of lack of political will or political expediency therein, we are unable to successfully implement the laws. Now, the other thing is about the ambiguities around the laws themselves. So, for instance, when Ghana's law was passed in 2005, the human trafficking law, which is the main law that addresses slavery, it didn't have adequate definitions. It didn't have any guidelines, what we call the legislative instrument that is required by law, required by the Constitution of Ghana in order to implement any law. It took the government 10 years, 10 full years, in order to pass the legislative instrument that will aid in the implementation of the law, which means that between 2005 and 2015, almost all those who perpetuated human trafficking and slavery went nearly scot-free. It was only a very few cases when those perpetrators were persecuted under the Criminal Offences Act. That's when we were able to achieve success. So 10 years, we were almost in a failed state when we had to address the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking. Evidently, when the law was passed and when the legislative instrument was also passed after 10 years, we began to see a lot of successes in prosecuting offenders. So between 2015 to date, we have prosecuted, Ghana has prosecuted and successfully prosecuted more offenses, more than 4 times than when the law was passed between 2005 and 2015. So that shows clearly that when the laws are sharp and they are more defined, it's more successful than when the laws are not sharp and are not clearly defined.
Thank you so much, James. Pam?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to share our experience in running global supply chains. Just to add an addendum, our global supply chains pass through any number of frontier economies like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. So basically, our experience basically takes in a range of lower and middle income economies. And basically, we found that human trafficking and forced labor are just 2 of the conditions that we need to eliminate in global supply chains. It has the similar roots to things like being forced to work overtime, not getting paid a fair wage for your work or even the legally mandated wage, working in severely unhealthy conditions. I would say that all of these are driven by 2 things. One is poverty in the host nation, as well as a lack of local economic opportunity, which leads people to seek opportunities elsewhere. And then the second is weak governance locally, which goes back to what James said about political will. The political will is really in the poor country, and we know that developing countries they need time to catch up on institution building. I think in terms of how you stop this, private sector action is essential, but then again, we've had compliance for decades, and it's the basic ILO core conventions and so on, and we still find instances where third parties actually contravene the conditions that they themselves sign up to accept. And I think it goes back to, when you have extreme poverty and lack of opportunity, it leads to people being almost forced to do unfortunate things. Now, that doesn't excuse the fact that, there are people who abuse their positions of power, and this needs to be eradicated. And that's where better governance locally would help. Now, what can you don't necessarily improve governance only internally. I think external forces have a lot to do. And if we think about how migrant workers have been regularized, okay, for example, going from Bangladesh or Pakistan to elsewhere to work, like Malaysia or so on, or even going from the Philippines abroad to work, the government has to realize that there's more economically to gain from regularizing and normalizing and standardizing and having a very transparent procedure to treat migrant workers. Nobody should lack the opportunity to be a migrant worker. Just because you're a migrant worker doesn't mean you are abused. So what we need to do is to try to normalize these kind of haphazard and informal processes and make it really possible to go abroad as a migrant worker with full respect. And I mean, you have instances in Asia where, there's a lot of migrant workers and the system works, but, the governments have to cooperate with each other. So that's just like to get us started. I'd love to hear what James thinks of that, whether in Africa, that practice of normalizing the sending of workers abroad could actually work, and whether he sees that happening.
Yeah, I mean, the regularization of migrant workers is a very thorny issue at this moment, and sometimes you ask yourself whether it's a chicken and egg situation. You ask yourself whether the chicken first or the egg first. It's a thorny issue. When some of these issues are regulated and more formalized, then the chances of people becoming vulnerable become minimal. So that there are employment agencies who are licensed by government to operate, and therefore, if I want to travel to, for instance, Bangladesh or UAE to work, I can go to this agency and I'll be able to access their services and be able to travel safely and be able to gain employment and go and work safely. So then there is a certain assurance that once I go through the regulated regime, then I'll be safe. If that is not done, then people tend to operate within the black market regime. And when we say black market, we're talking about people who hide to do the wrong things that might have to lead to the right things. Now, unfortunately, that is what we have witnessed over the years in Africa, that in most cases, there are these unscrupulous recruitment agencies that promises a whole lot of juicy jobs and employment outside of the country. So one would say that to be clean, regulation and normalizing and formalizing the processes of having people leave their country and go and work in another country is the way to go. However, there is this unfortunate fees and charges and unenforced laws that stares in our face. So if somebody has established a business, it wants to make profits. And so there are a lot of exorbitant fees that are charged on prospective travelers that becomes debt to them, and sometimes that makes them vulnerable to slavery. So that's why I say it's a chicken and egg situation. You don't know whether we should look at regulation and should look at formalization in order to address the issues, or what do you do? I don't have an answer now, but I believe that these are my thoughts.
I think you've just pointed out that there's two issues we're dealing with. One is the opportunity given to individual through a normalized process, and second, the role of businesses who should enjoin their suppliers and enjoin their business partners not to engage in such practices. It's fine to make money, but you can't you can't ride roughshod over the codes of conduct within supply chains. So businesses, buyers especially, have a responsibility to not basically condone or not like look the other way when they know that there's unscrupulous practices. I swear, you go into a factory and you know when there's abuse going on. I mean, there's ways to detect it. So I can't accept that some companies say, but we didn't know. Okay, and I know that there's a lot of ways to hide unscrupulous practices, like even hide that there's child labor. But repeat visits, if you've been working with a supplier for many years, and you know that somehow they're producing so much more than would be logical in their record books, then it's up to the buyer to make those inquiries and to really find out what's going on. Sorry, Philippe, back to you.
Thank you, Pamela. I think this is great, actually. I'm glad we mentioned the role of company and sort of like maximization of profit, but to what cost at some point, I think will be an important conversation to have. I would also add climate change as a reason for people to go, racism, corruption, and so many others. But this is a complex topic. So, but we were just talking now about migrant workers and survivors of trafficking. So let's go at that level, because we were just at the policy level. But I want to ground us in the reality of experiences as well. You both have a global voice that goes way beyond your day-to-day work, and people are listening to what you're saying today, but in general. At the same time, we are in the middle of this pandemic still, and this has certainly accelerated discussions around the critical inclusion of all participants in our societies. How can we meaningfully include and elevate the voices of those with lived experience of trafficking and forced labor to change policies and practices, so that the solutions are also informed by those with lived experience all around, from policies and business to all the way to business practices? How can the private sector engage with NGOs, but specifically around elevating the voices of those who have experienced forced labor or human trafficking? James, would you like to start?
You see, the issue of survivor and survivor inclusion and making sure that the voices of survivors are effectively heard and included has gained currency in the past years. First of all, we need to know and acknowledge that to have your voices heard is to have capacity to do so. So if there's one thing you wanting to be heard, and another thing having the capacity to be heard. So if you don't have the capacity, you could be given the opportunity and you will still not be able to articulate the issues. So I believe that the first step in ensuring that there's effective inclusion, in ensuring that the voices of survivors are heard, is to build their capacity, the individual capacity. We're talking about training, we're talking about motivation, we're talking about creating an environment which is safe for them, etc. But also the other thing is, we have a number of survivors who have moved away from, being a single voice to now mobilizing other voices in order for them to be heard. So not only a single person being heard, but a collection of other survivors being heard. And I'm talking about survivor-led organizations, across the globe. There's a need for us to intensify our effort at encouraging such survivors and helping them to have sustainability in their movement, in their organizations, in order to be able to be part and continuously be part of the conversation. That is also very important. And also the assurance of privacy, assurance of, if, for instance, if a survivor wants to contribute to a conversation, but doesn't want his contribution to go beyond a certain limit, how are we sure that such privacy will be accorded such survivors? I know a number of survivors, and I personally don't, I don't buy always my voice is out there. I'm okay, totally okay. But I know a number of survivors who work in a very difficult environment that if their voices are heard, they become even more vulnerable. So there's also an assurance that we need to provide in the global community that would assure them that when their voices are being heard, it will be heard in a safe way that will not bring them issues. The last one about making sure that survivors' voices are heard, or how we can include their voices there. I mean, as I am having a conversation with you, you can see that I'm having a lot of internet cuts. And most survivors are from vulnerable communities, are from vulnerable democracies, are from democracies that, or areas that do not have tools or systems that support their work. How do we make sure that they have what it takes to be able to participate in terms of facilitation? These are very important for us to consider in order to have meaningful survivor inclusion, meaningful survivor voices being included in the conversations.
Thank you. Pam, what are your thoughts on inclusion of survivors' voice in a state?
Yeah, so obviously James has raised so many crucial issues. I can only add that from a business perspective, it's incumbent on us to engage with NGOs continuously, not just for the issue of forced labor, but also for all of the other things that we are, we are working to eradicate in supply chains. It's also, I think, essential to engage with your own suppliers, because they're the front line. They're the front line who is going to detect what's going on, right? And you have to ensure that they're educated enough to know the impacts. And I think one thing which can really help now is to use technology. I mean, we have everyone knows that there's a simulation which is done among the so-called rich and powerful about the experience of being poor. Now with virtual reality, I mean, we have actually created internally within our group virtual reality to educate our own staff about what conditions are faced by workers in unsafe factories or workers in any factories. And the thing is, you need political will from the top. You need the management. You need but the people who are going to actually detect and enforce the policy, they need to be educated too. That's your middle and junior management. So now we got to use every technology at our disposal to engage our own people and make this kind of known to everybody who actually has any ability to influence the outcome. And that's basically everybody. Like, they have to know that this isn't the responsibility of the CSR or the compliance department. This is everybody's responsibility who works in the business. And there's only one way to get everyone over the hump, and that's by educating. And so I think we have a huge opportunity to use education to use technology to bring those stories to everyone who counts.
I'm going to push you a little bit. Education is nice. We've seen a lot of voluntary regimes and good announcements and the CSR, as you said, corporate social responsibility. But these have had very mild, if any, effects at all. Maybe on the opposite side, with mandatory human rights due diligence that we see emerging, they're not perfect, but it has a little bit more bite than the rest. So how does a company like the Fung Group, looks at mandatory human rights due diligence and goes beyond? Education is necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah, really good point. Personally, I think due diligence guidelines are essential. I'm not sure about mandatory, because then that leads to this kind of mentality of just, let me go through the process and then I've done my part. You got to focus on outcome. Okay, how are you going to get companies to have better outcomes? Number one is through public disclosure. So I'd much rather see mandatory disclosure of outcomes on this. It's just like in front of a construction site. The site is required to post the daily accident, or hopefully zero, but like these are mandatory disclosures. This will help get companies to really take it seriously. The second thing is that in the buyer economies, I think the government and the business have to work really closely together to create the right opportunities for the supplier economies. We know there's a huge gap, okay? We know there's a huge gap in income, but better coordination, between the policy level and the private policies, which are actually conducted in global supply chains, would help. And I think disclosure of where those standards are not upheld, that's also good. I mean, nobody wants to be like on the front page of the New York Times, right, about this. People don't forget. We always said, okay, people forget, and there's a lot of news every day, but it stays with your brand. And so I think I don't think consumers, have all the power, but consumers do have power, same as governments do, and same as executives do. And so I would encourage, any executive who is watching this panel today, like, ask the question, because otherwise things won't change. I think we have to make progress a lot faster. That's one thing, because especially as trade and communications links increase, maybe not during the pandemic, but in general, and as more and more frontier economies get into global supply chains, like, we have to get a lot better at this.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick point on what Pamela just said. And I'm so happy that corporate social responsibility is looking at all of these due diligence issues and the environment and so on and so forth. Now, at every stage in this process, we must acknowledge the fact that it is because some people have suffered. That is why we came to this conclusion that we have to address it. Now, if we are going to address it, other people have already walked the path of being victims. How do we include them in the process of addressing these issues? That's a very important question that every corporation, every company must ask itself. That there are others who have walked in this path of slavery and this part of trafficking, for which reason we now have an opportunity to address these issues. How do we ensure that in the process of addressing these issues, their voices are heard? Because they have walked the path before. So for me, that's the question that needs to be answered all the time, at every stage in the due diligence process.
Thank you so much, James. Really appreciate this answer. And really what we are discussing here essentially is how to effect change, from policymakers to investors to boardrooms, consumers, and society at large. Can you maybe share a little bit of your expertise around how change happens? How were you able to push for a change, either with your suppliers or with the policymakers that you engage with, or anybody else? Like, what's coming into the way of addressing forced labor and human trafficking? Maybe in a few minutes as we approach the end of this session.
Well, I would say that the first thing that every nation looks at in governance is its own laws, especially its constitution. I mean, the overarching law for every country is a constitution. So that if the laws are properly enforced, that is important. If the laws are not enforced, then there are huge obstacles to comprehensively providing solution to the problem. Now, I believe in my context specifically, for instance, I will want to add appropriate enforcement of laws. I say appropriate enforcement of laws because there are so many different socio-economic issues that are confronting the citizens of my country. And therefore, as you untie, as you unravel one, you are leaving the other. So for instance, if somebody perpetuates slavery, that person needs to go to jail. If a mother goes to jail, leaving 3 children, the question that a US government will answer will be that, okay, this now, these children are now a subject of law. So the government will take them and take care of them through school, through feeding and everything. But in my country, that will not happen. A mother go to jail for selling a child. The children become orphaned, they become neglected. So by solving one problem, you have created a much bigger problem. So there is a holistic need, need for approach to address the issue of social protection, at the same time law enforcement. I believe that if we do this in my country, in the next 10 years, we will not be talking about slavery in Ghana.
So just to build on that, I think we have to look at the fact that everyone has power in this. So in terms of government, I would say that policy helps, government to government contacts help, but that since the problem is so complex, as James has said, it's like poverty, it's institutions, it's the practices, it's lack of punishment. I think we have to avoid solutions where you just get cut off or sanctioned, because the answer to this is to create more opportunities and to bring the normalization of practices with international standards to countries which are just at the early stages of development. So I think it's up to us to integrate countries more. And avoid this kind of very simplistic approach where we just say, okay, well, yeah, then we're leaving. The second thing is to look at what the private sector can do, especially in global supply chains. We do have responsibility and we do have the power to affect change. At the same time, there's a lot of business pressures which prevent that on a day-to-day basis because it's just more convenient to look elsewhere. So I think, we need to educate a lot more. We need to educate our own consumer about what the problem is and to let them know that, they too are part of this. And you brought up one group, Philippe, which is investors. When investors ask us, what about human rights? What about living wage? What about forced labor? Of course, we know all these issues. They're all in the ILO core conventions, but for investors to actually ask about them, that takes it into another level, and you're forced to reconcile what those commitments mean, and then to mandate more disclosure about this. And I know, mandatory disclosure is not a perfect process. There's a lot of things which are disclosed which are not necessarily verified, but nobody said the world's perfect. Right? We got to start somewhere, and the whole process of iteration. Don't stop starting it simply because we don't have the grand design. And I guarantee after we solve this forced labor problem, there's going to be something else which is just as important, which is going to come up. There always is. That's what we see happening with climate change. The last thing is that we got to be smarter with technology. Today. You can inform and empower factory workers about their rights and about their own potential using their mobile phone. That's something else we've done. Equip people with the right infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and then with the right technology. Create that transparency. Create empowered citizens so that they can speak up and make their stories heard. So I can only think that technology could be a big help, but just we're not thinking in that way as a community, and maybe we should look at that for real solutions. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you. We've heard technology, education, appropriate implementation of the law. There are so many ideas, and they're not just ideas, they're already things that are in place. We need to maybe accelerate and I think open up the tent a little bit more to have more allies towards that goal. Really appreciate your thoughts today to both of you.